In this video I will tell you every secret about the Spectacular Spider-Man, Easter eggs, references and more. Well, hello there, Spider-Dash here. Get ready to know more about the Spectacular Spider-Man. Whether you're a member of the Spider Society or a newcomer to the Spider-Verse, this video is for you. So hit that subscribe button and give me a like to get more members of the Spider Society on board. Remember that with great content comes great entertainment.
That's not even how the saying goes.
And with that out of the way, let's begin! The cartoon starts with Spider-Man doing a bit of jumps between buildings. You know, Spider-Man stuff. But one of the first things that we can appreciate is a gargoyle. And that is no coincidence because Greg Weisman, main producer of the show, also was the main producer of the Disney show, Gargoyles. The next thing that we can appreciate is Spider-Man's voice.
I am the Spectacular Spider-Man!
The voice actor of Peter Parker / Spider-Man is none other than Josh Keaton. He's the voice of Spider-Man in multiple video games like Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, Marvel vs. Capcom 3, and Marvel Super Hero Squad, and the voice of Electro in Marvel's Spider-Man. Then we move on to Flynn Marko and Alex O'Hearn, aka Sandman and Rhino, robbing what it seems to be a jewelry shop. Then we move on to Spider-Man flashing the Spider Signal in all of its glory. And it is on Spider-Man's belt as it should be. The Spider-Man from the 90s also had this device. The first appearance of the Spider Signal was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 3. And then we move on to the best intro ever. Non-debatable. Spectacular, spectacular Spider-Man, spectacular, spectacular Spider-Man, spectacular. The theme song of this show was composed by the Tenderbox, a group of Mexican Americans that live in LA. And there is also a lot of references in the intro. First, a reference to the Amazing Fantasy issue 15. There is a critique to Spider-Man done by J. Jonah Jameson that spoils most of the major villains that appear on the show. Here is a reference to Sean Galloway and Greg Weisman. Greg Weisman is the main producer of the show, as I already mentioned, and Sean Galloway is the main artist. Also, if you wonder why Peter Parker has a mole on his left eye, it's because Sean Galloway has a mole on the same spot, and he puts that mole in most of the characters that he designs. The Spectacular Spider-Man is one of the few projects that thanks Stan Lee and Steve Ditko for the creation of Spider-Man. Most projects just thank Stan Lee. And the name of the show, The Spectacular Spider-Man, was inspired in the comic Peter Parker, The Spectacular Spider-Man. There is a comic just named The Spectacular Spider-Man, but Peter Parker, The Spectacular Spider-Man was published first.
It isn't getting any easier, Anna. We're almost out of money.
Money problems? Just like any good Spider-Man story. Next, we're introduced to a character that pretty much no one knew about. And that is Silly April. She literally appears in the first page of The Amazing Fantasy issue 15, and will later become the hero, Bluebird. She also appears in The Amazing Spider-Man, played by Kelsey Chow, and in Spider-Man Homecoming, played by Isabella Amara. Kinda funny how her appearance in The Spectacular Spider-Man made her appear in Spider-Man movies when no one knew about her before. Something similar happened to Liz Allan, that appears also in this episode and will later become a pretty important character and the best girl in the show. She was changed from a blonde in the comics to a brunette in this show, change that will be consistent in Spider-Man Homecoming, where she is played by Laura Harrier. In the novelization of the first Spider-Man film, it's revealed that the girl that doesn't let Peter sit next to her is also Liz Allan, but that appearance was mostly unnoticed. Next, we move on to Peter's classroom. On the chalkboard there's a secret, and that is that it contains the name of the next episodes of the show and the name of that same episode, and that is Survival of the Fittest, Natural Selection, and Interactions. Next, the scene where Peter remembers being bitten by the spider is a reference to the scene of the Raimi trilogy. The DNA sequence is almost identical. The scene where Peter, Harry, and Norman are talking in the balcony has a tiny secret. In Norman's laptop, there is a circle filled with green, red, and purple. This is foreshadowing that he will later become the Green Goblin. After Norman gets kidnapped by the Vulture and then the Vulture drops him, there is another reference to The Amazing Fantasy issue 15. Vulture's suit is black and red instead of the classic green. This might be a reference to Vulture's suit in the comics Marvel Knights, where his suit has the same colors. Actually, the scene where Vulture is suiting up, the room is lit by a green light. This is a reference to his green suit in the comics. The first appearance of the Vulture was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 2. After Spider-Man drops Norman at the police station, there is a pretty dark secret, and that is that the officers that help Norman Osborn are Jean DeWolf and Stanley Carter, better known as the Sin Eater. If you know a bit about comics, you'll know that the Sin Eater ends up killing Jean DeWolf, thing that was unlikely to happen in the show. But we know that they actually had plans to make the Sin Eater a villain in this show, in the now cancelled 3rd season. I'll give you a detail that is about the show in general and not just this episode. The first teaser of The Spectacular Spider-Man was not in a TV spot, but it was actually in the video game Spider-Man Free or Foe, in the extra section of the game.
You heard the one about great power coming with great responsibility?
Do I even have to say something? Then we move on to Peter in Dr. Connor's lab, and we meet Eddie Brock, who is a mix of the Ultimate version and the 616 universe. Next, Dr. Connors is injecting himself with a green substance, and we see a bit of reptiles around. All of this foreshadowing that he will later become the Lizard. When the newspaper lands on Peter's face, there is also a bit of details worth mentioning. One is that the pictures that we see in the newspaper are frames of this exact same episode that we see earlier when the episode begins. Also, Spider-Man is written without the hyphen.
Don't forget the hyphen between Spider and Man.
Then we meet J. Jonah Jameson, and although most people won't acknowledge it, he's one of the most important characters in the Spider-Man universe, appearing since the first issue. In this episode, Spider-Man fights the Enforcers, classic villains of Spider-Man, although mostly unknown. Their first appearance was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 10, and then Spider-Man defeats the Enforcers and the Vulture, and there isn't much else in this episode, except that this and every episode ends with Spider-Man's face in the background. That is how the classic Spider-Man comics used to end. The episode ends with Peter Parker being thankful that he has Aunt May.
And I still have this amazing person watching out for me. Tell me there's something better.
So remember to be thankful for what you have and tell your mom that you love her right now. The second episode starts in Empire State University. This is a fictional university that exists in the comics, that Peter Parker eventually graduates from. Max Dillon getting his powers from a tank of electric eels in this episode was the inspiration to Electro getting his powers the same way in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Peter Parker's ringtone is the children's song Itsy Bitsy Spider.
The itsy bitsy spider went up the water spout.
The web swing sequence of Spider-Man going to high school is a reference to Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2. All the web swing animations are identical to web swing scenes from that movie. All the references to Sam Raimi's Spider-Man are meant to not confuse Spider-Man fans that only watched the movies and didn't read the comics. Peter Parker assists to Midtown High School. This is a fictional high school that exists in the comics. It was featured more prominently in the Spider-Man movies from the MCU. We see multiple times in different newspapers a camera named TSK-1. This is because that is the camera that Peter buys later in the show.
Look, this tutoring thing is something you need, not me, so when you're ready to learn, let me know.
Spider-Man teaching you how to be an absolute chat. And just after that, we have another reference to Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, to the first suit up in the first movie. Electro's design in this show is original, although it still has the same colors as his design in the comics. The first appearance of Electro was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 9. While Spider-Man is fighting Electro, he's using a rubber glove. The same thing happened in the comics the first time that Spider-Man fights Electro. Although in the comics, he's using rubber gloves in both hands and in the show just in one. Spider-Man defeats Electro by throwing him to a pool filled with water. The first time that Spider-Man defeated Electro in the comics was in a similar way, using water. And that wraps up things for this episode. Episode 3 starts with Spider-Man leaving a note to the police after stopping a robbery. Leaving notes is something that Spider-Man used to do in the comics. Aunt May and Peter Parker live in Forest Hills, New York. This isn't the exact same address, but it's around the same area where the house of Aunt May is located in the Raimi films. Gwen standing up for Peter in this show might have been the reference for Gwen standing up for Peter in The Amazing Spider-Man. In this episode, Spider-Man fights the Lizard. His design is straight out of the comics. The Lizard's first appearance was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 6. In this episode, we learn that Spider-Man is 5'6" feet tall.
Now if I were a 6'5" lizard instead of a 5'6" spider.
At least that's his height in this cartoon. In official Marvel guides, it's revealed that Spider-Man's height is 5'10". The serum to neutralize the lizard powers that Gwen and Martha Connors made in this episode is the same serum that causes Spider-Man to grow 4 arms in the comics. And finally, Spider-Man reminds you that you don't need a parade to do the right thing.
Spider-Man's no magic wand, but thanks to the webhead, Kurt's cured, and Billy gets his father back. So what if nobody threw a parade? Spidey stays because Spidey's needed.
So remember that no matter if no one notices, never give up no matter what. Hi, if you're this far in the video, it means that you're enjoying it, or at the very least, you find the facts that I'm listing amusing, so please, consider giving me a like and clicking the subscribe button. And with that out of the way, let's continue. The first thing that we see in this episode is Montana becoming the Shocker. He was the leader of the Enforcers in the first episode. Just like in the comics, he was first an Enforcer, and later he became the Shocker. Montana also appears in Homecoming, although he's not there for long. The Shocker's design in this show is almost one-to-one with the comic version. The Shocker's first appearance was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 46. Peter Parker with his suit on hiding under a blanket to conceal his identity from Aunt May in this episode was what inspired the same thing happening in The Amazing Spider-Man 2.
I've just been visiting with Anna and her niece, Mary Jane. A lovely girl. Peter, you must meet her.
Aunt May tries to arrange a date between Peter and MJ, just like in the comics. There is an animation error on Eddie Brock's phone. The keyboard changes color from one frame to the other. There is a poster from the Disney movie Tron in Harry's bedroom, although here it's named Tron, possibly to avoid copyright issues. When Peter goes to the Daily Bugle, we can see some interesting headers in the newspapers that are hung on the background. One mentions the first time that a man walked on the moon. Other mentions his son John Jameson being renowned as a captain of a space shuttle. Another mentions Jameson buying the Bugle, implying that in this show, the Daily Bugle was not created by J. Jonah Jameson. And a last one mentioning Jameson as a winner of a Pulitzer Award. This is an award that is given to the best journalists. In this episode, Flash and Peter almost have a rope climbing competition. In the now cancelled third season, we will have seen a box match between Peter and Flash, just like in the comics.
But the photos themselves... You have your camera on you?
She's kinda hard to keep in focus.
This won't cut it.
Robbie mentions the low quality of Peter's pictures of Spider-Man. This is again something straight out of the comics. Robbie didn't want to buy pictures from Peter because of their poor quality, but Jameson insisted in buying them because he secretly knew that Peter needed the money after the death of Uncle Ben. In this episode we see Peter Parker buy the aforementioned camera. He also asks Betty Brant to go with him to his prom party in high school. This is again a reference to the comics, where Betty Brant was Peter Parker's first girlfriend, although in the show they just stay as friends. Here we can see Frederick Foswell for the first time, who in the comics is the big man.
Oh, ain't nothing personal, Hoss. Simple truth is, if a man's a man, he honors his responsibilities, and you're one of mine.
But a man has to honor his responsibilities. You're one of mine. Aunt May, please.
Spider-Man teaching you that you can always positively use everything that you learn. This episode starts with Peter Parker webbing his bedroom to practice his powers. This is a reference to a scene of the first Spider-Man film where Peter does the same. There's many instances throughout the whole show where we can appreciate that Peter Parker's face is half Spider-Man and half Peter Parker. This is a reference to the comics, where the same used to happen to reflect the duality that exists within Spider-Man. There's a scene of Peter Parker imagining himself as Spider-Man playing football. This might be a reference to Web of Spider-Man issue 34, where Spider-Man plays football to save the universe. In this episode, Spider-Man fights Sandman. His first appearance was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 4. This episode features Glory as part of Flash Thompson's friend group. In the comics, her full name is Gloria Grant, and she is Peter Parker's neighbor. The scene where Peter Parker plays football and then we see some spiky hair coming out of the tip of his fingers is a reference to the scene of the first Raimi film where Peter Parker climbs a wall for the first time. In this episode, Emily Osborn has a small cameo. She is Norman Osborn's wife and Harry Osborn's mom. In most universes, she is dead, but weirdly enough, she is alive here. She will have been a more important character in the now cancelled third season. And that wraps up things for this episode. Episode 6 starts with the revelation of one of the main villains of the show.
Your Mr. Lincoln will be pleased.
Mr. Lincoln, aka Tombstone. In this episode, we learn that Peter Parker is 16 years old. He has been Spider-Man for 1 year, which means that he got his powers when he was 15 years old, which is comic accurate. In this episode, Spider-Man fights the Rhino. His first appearance was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 41. Rhino goes to the Bugle to inquire about Peter Parker's whereabouts, and Jameson conceals any information regarding Peter Parker, proving that even if he hates Spider-Man, he has integrity. This scene is a reference to a scene of the first Raimi film where the same situation happens, but with the Green Goblin instead. The name Alex O'Hearn is an anagram of Rhino, and that is Rhino's name in this show, The Ultimate Comics, and the show from the 60s. In the main comics, his name is... yeah. Spider-Man saves a mother and a daughter from an attack of the Rhino. The thing is that this mother and daughter are the same characters that appear on the intro of the show. Inside Norman Osborn's house, we see a green mask that looks like a goblin. This is foreshadowing that he will eventually become the Green Goblin. Peter asks Frederick Foswell for the identity of the Big Man. As I already mentioned, Frederick Foswell is the Big Man in the comics. Tombstone is the only character of the show who has eye pupils. Every other character just has irises. The first appearance of Tombstone was in Web of Spider-Man issue 36. When Spider-Man is running away from Tombstone, we can see a building with the name Ditko. This is a reference to Spider-Man's co-creator, Steve Ditko.
Face it, Tiger. You just hit the jackpot.
This is a reference to the original introduction of MJ in the comics, in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 42. But there's more. This episode ends with a Spider-Man symbol shaped like a heart. The first time that we saw a Spider-Man logo shaped like a heart was in The Amazing Spider-Man Annual issue 21, where Peter and Mary Jane have their wedding, pointing out that they were going to end up together in the show. It is confirmed that the Spectacular Spider-Man was going to have between 5 and 6 seasons, and it was going to end with the wedding of Peter and Mary Jane. And with that, we wrap up this episode.
Leave off the threads, Emerald Elf.
Episode 7 starts with Spider-Man calling the Green Goblin Emerald Elf. In the comics and other media, Emerald Elf is one of the nicknames that Spider-Man usually gives to the Green Goblin.
Who are you? No, wait. Let me guess. The Emerald Elf?
Me?
The Green Goblin has two different voice actors in the show, one for Norman Osborn and the other for the Emerald Elf. The voice actor of Norman Osborn is Alan Ranchins, and the voice actor of the Green Goblin is Steve Blum. This was done so people won't figure out the identity of the Green Goblin so easy, because at some point the show wants you to believe that Harry Osborn is the real Green Goblin. The first appearance of the Green Goblin was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 14. The Green Goblin shoots lasers out of the tip of his fingers. This might seem weird, but it's something that the Green Goblin actually used to do in his first appearances in the comics. Sean Galloway, character designer of the show, has a cameo as the DJ of Midtown High. Ned Leeds appears in this show, although he is named Ned Lee instead, and is clearly Asian. Maybe this was something that inspired Ned Leeds being Asian in the MCU. Harry Osborn drinks something called Globulin Green. Obviously, that is a wordplay referring to the Green Goblin. Globulin Green is an element exclusive to the show, and it doesn't exist in the comics. But there's one more detail regarding this. The number that is on the vial that Harry is holding, 994, is a reference to Greg Weisman's show, Gargoyles. 994 refers to the year that the Wyvern Massacre took place in that show. While Spider-Man is falling, we can see a marketing team discussing a bug spray. This is a reference to the fact that one of Spider-Man's weaknesses is bug spray. Once, the Spider-Slayer almost killed him by using bug spray. There's a continuity error in this episode. Spider-Man runs out of webs in both web shooters. He refills the left web shooter, but uses both a few seconds later. He reloads the right web shooter shortly after. So this doesn't make much sense. And that wraps up things for this episode. Episode 8 starts like this. And I don't even have to say anything, do I? That is an obvious reference to Spider-Man stopping the train in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2. The man that Spider-Man saves from being hit by the truck is one of the musicians that appears in the previous episode, playing at Tombstone's party. But there's more. This man is named Pete Parker, and in the 6th episode of this season, Rhino was supposed to confuse him with Peter Parker, and go after him at the Daily Bugle. But this was cut because the team didn't have enough time. We know that thanks to Greg Weisman. Spider-Man saves two people from being crushed by a car, a man and a woman. Remember them, they will be important later on.
It's not like we're going steady or something equally primitive. We're friends, okay?
Harry Osborn drinks more globulin green, and it still has the same number, 994, which doesn't make much sense, unless he is refilling the same vial. Dr. Octopus gets his transformation like in the comics, but the scene where the mechanical arms blend with his body is a reference to Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2. Dr. Octopus' first appearance was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 3. Spider-Man catapults himself with his webs. This is a detail that is more classic than you think, appearing since the first issue of The Amazing Spider-Man, and being present in some movies, and even in some video games, being featured in the upcoming game Marvel's Spider-Man 2. Peter goes to the fair with Liz Allan as his date. They play a minigame where Peter wins a plushie of an octopus that he gives to Liz Allan. The plushie being an octopus is an obvious reference that in this episode, Spider-Man fights Doc Ock. When Spider-Man defeats Doc Ock, he throws him into a ride themed after an octopus. Again, this is a reference to Doc Ock. And with that, we wrap up things for this episode. Episode 9 starts with something that looks like a costume of a man-wolf. This is a reference to one of John Jameson's alter egos, Man-Wolf. We can see the symbiote before it's officially introduced in the show. The asteroid that hit John Jameson's shuttle had the symbiote hidden. If you look closely, you can actually see it. This episode takes place on Halloween, and here we can see Black Cat for the first time before she is officially introduced, using the fact that it's Halloween to hide in plain sight. More visuals implying that Harry is the Green Goblin, but here we can see other visual cues implying that Norman is the Green Goblin. Obviously, all of this was done just to confuse you. Tombstone and Spider-Man say the same thing to the Green Goblin.
When tonight? Where?
When tonight? Where?
To which the Green Goblin responds this.
Anyone else getting deja vu?
Being the only time that someone breaks the fourth wall in this show.
Very nicely. You can web me up anytime, Petey.
The Green Goblin throws a sticky substance at Spider-Man and then grabs him. This is a reference to the cover of The Amazing Spider-Man 39. The Green Goblin turns Spider-Man's suit a little bit, and we can see some continuity errors. The parts that were torn off his suit disappear in some shots, and then they appear again. And with that, we wrap up this episode. Episode 10 starts with Black Cat stealing the symbiote from Dr. Connor's lab. Black Cat's first appearance was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 194. There is a change in the intro that will stay for the rest of the season, since in the last episode Harry went on a trip on Europe, his character introduction in the intro was changed with Mary Jane in his place. The main bad guy in this episode is the Chameleon. His first appearance was in the first issue of The Amazing Spider-Man. The sidekick of the Chameleon in this episode is Quentin Beck, aka Mysterio. In this scene, we can see a picture of Uncle Ben with Aunt May, but there's more. A few seconds later, we can see two more pictures, one that is probably of the wedding of Uncle Ben and Aunt May, and other of a baby Peter Parker with his parents, Richard and Mary Parker. The symbiote suit of Spider-Man in this episode is a reference to the symbiote suit in Spider-Man 3. Peter Parker mentions that him and Eddie Brock lost their parents in a plane crash.
No, Eddie and I lost our parents in a plane just like that.
Peter's parents also died in a plane crash in the Ultimate Comics. In this episode, the Chameleon commits crime while pretending to be Spider-Man to end Spider-Man's reputation as a hero. This is not the first time that someone has done something like that. In the comics, Mysterio, Kraven, Venom, and even the Chameleon himself have done that to end Spider-Man's reputation. Here's another reference to Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, when Spider-Man discovers that he has the symbiote suit. The episode ends with Spider-Man and Black Cat sharing an upside-down kiss. This is a reference to the upside-down kiss of Spider-Man and MJ in the first Sam Raimi film. And with that, we wrap up this episode. Episode 11 starts in Ravencroft, mental institute that tries to reform villains. But we can see Electro talking to Dr. Kafka. She's a character from the comics, but we also saw this character in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, although the gender of Dr. Kafka was changed to a male in that movie. Then we move on to Doc Ock recruiting the Sinister Six. The formation is a bit different than in the comics, consisting of Rhino, Shocker, Sandman, Electro, Vulture, and Doc Ock. The original Sinister Six consisted of Mysterio, Kraven, Vulture, Electro, Sandman, and Doc Ock. The first appearance of the Sinister Six was in The Amazing Spider-Man Annual Issue 1. The Sinister Six breaking out of prison in this episode might have been inspired by the Sinister Six doing the same in Spider-Man the Animated Series, aka the show from the 90s. Peter Parker has a picture of Albert Einstein in his room. Andrew and Tobey's Spider-Man also had a picture of Albert Einstein in their rooms. We can see more pictures of Richard and Mary Parker in this scene, and others of Peter Parker as a child. Eddie and MJ go on a date. Eddie mentions that Peter's dad, Richard Parker, and his dad, Eddie Brock Sr., used to be lab partners. This is just like in the Ultimate Comics, where they are lab partners as well. The only difference is that in the Ultimate Comics, the symbiote was created by Richard and Eddie to cure cancer, and in this show, the symbiote came from outer space. Also, Eddie Brock's jacket is foreshadowing that he will later become Venom. Spider-Man's symbiote suit looks different than in the last episode. The more the symbiote bonds with Peter Parker, the more it looks like the classic symbiote suit in the comics. The first time that we saw the symbiote in the comics was in Secret Wars issue 8. The symbiote suit takes control of Peter's body while he's asleep. The same thing happened in the comics and in the show of the 90s. And with that, we wrap up this episode. Episode 12 starts with Aunt May and Peter at the hospital. This scene looks similar to a scene where the same happens in the first Raimi film. There's an animation error. Harry Osborn appears for a few frames even though he's supposed to be in Europe. This is either an error or Harry Osborn never left and Norman Osborn was using his son to spy on Peter Parker. Most likely it was an animation error. The whole sequence of Spider-Man trying to remove the black suit is a reference to the scene where Peter Parker removes the symbiote in Spider-Man 3. The scene where the spider bites Peter is identical to the same scene in the first Raimi film, although Mary Jane's role is replaced with Gwen Stacy. The scene where Peter tries his powers for the first time is a reference to the Amazing Fantasy issue 15 as well as a small reference to the first Raimi film. The wrestling match in this scene is identical to the wrestling match in the first Raimi film, where they also fight in a cage. Although here Spider-Man fights Crusher Hogan like in the comics, and not Bonesaw. The whole scene where Peter doesn't stop the thief is identical to the same scene in the first Raimi film. The scene where Uncle Ben gives Peter the talk about the great power is identical to the first Raimi film. The scene where Peter confronts Uncle Ben's killer is similar to the same scene in the first Raimi film. Although in this version, Spider-Man catches the criminal before he hits the ground. And in the Raimi film, Spider-Man doesn't catch him. The scene where Peter defeats the symbiote is a reference to the cover of The Amazing Spider-Man issue 100. Eddie Brock finally becomes Venom, and with that, we wrap up this episode. Episode 13 starts with Spider-Man fighting some thugs, really similar to the Enforcers, in the same building than in the first episode. Although this time, Spider-Man defeats them way easier than in the first episode. All of this to reflect that Spider-Man has matured and gotten better as a hero.
And we could use some help holding the big Mustang balloon at the Thanksgiving Day parade tomorrow? That's okay.
Oh, are you going back today? Because I'll go with you.
Parker's luck at its finest. Peter Parker mentions a pizzeria named Romita's.
I wonder if Romita's delivers turkey and Fixin's pizza.
Which means that in this universe, there is a restaurant named Romita's. That is a reference to one of the most famous Spider-Man artists, John Romita.
We're poison to Peter Parker and Spider-Man. We're Venom!
One of the best introductions of Venom in any media. Venom's first appearance was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 300. Venom leaves a message to Spider-Man made out of his organic webs. This is a reference to Spider-Man 3, where Venom does the same. Venom turns Spider-Man's suit, and again there's some continuity errors in Spider-Man's suit. The torn parts in his costume disappear and reappear again from one scene to the other. Spider-Man and Venom fight on top of some inflatable balloons, which might be a reference to the first Raimi film, where Spider-Man also fights on top of inflatable balloons, but with the Green Goblin instead. In this frame, we can see closely the picture of Peter's parents, Richard and Mary Parker, and we can see Peter Parker as a baby as well. And with that, we wrap up this season. Well, hey there, if you're enjoying the video, please consider giving me a like and clicking the subscribe button. I'll give you some details about the Spectacular Spider-Man that happened outside the show. The Spectacular Spider-Man had some action figures made by Hasbro that honestly were great. Nowadays, they're incredibly expensive. It had a collaboration with McDonald's. They don't make toys this awesome for McDonald's these days. It also had a collaboration with Burger King. with a set of toys that were equally awesome. This show is on iTunes, which is great, but the description of some episodes is totally wrong, mentioning characters that don't appear in the show, like the Kingpin and even the Human Torch. Speaking of which, this show was supposed to have crossovers with other Marvel shows. The X-Men and the Avengers were planned to appear, but it never happened because of license issues. Many people still speculate to this day if the Spider-Man that appears on Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes is the Spectacular Spider-Man. Young Justice is a show that was also produced by Greg Weisman. It has a cameo of a villainous version of Spider-Man that was even voiced by Josh Keaton.
You were warned, Mr. Jones. No one likes a crusading reporter. I'm sorry. You know how it is. I'm on deadline.
In the third season, we will have seen the Scorpion, Carnage, Hydro-Man, Mr. Negative, Sin Eater, the Hobgoblin, and even it will have had a cameo of the Spider-Mobile. The Spectacular Spider-Man was supposed to have DVD movies, one of them a beach episode with Peter and his classmates. The DVD and Blu-ray versions of the Spectacular Spider-Man were supposed to have deleted scenes and extra footage of the episodes, but this idea was scrapped. Most likely, those deleted scenes are in some drawer in the offices of Sony. What inspired the Spectacular Spider-Man was Hong Kong action movies, and more specifically, the movies of the actor Bruce Lee. It was here where the art style of the show was born, consisting in giving the characters really long limbs. The Spectacular Spider-Man was cancelled because Disney bought Marvel, and with that, the television rights of Spider-Man. The Spectacular Spider-Man appears in Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, but did you know that his appearance in that movie was leaked? While Josh Keaton was making a livestream in his Twitch channel, he said this.
Are you even allowed to say Spider-Verse? I'm allowed to say it. Yes, nobody is holding a gun to my head and saying you cannot say it. But, you know, I can't confirm or deny anything about anything.
Well, in Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, it's revealed that sadly, his version of George Stacy died, but for some reason, he has his hair black instead of grey, as we see it in the show. Spectacular Spider-Man even says some lines, and it's really easy to miss, but we can see the Spectacular Spider-Man holding the Spider-Cat in one scene. And with that said, let's continue with Season 2. The first episode of the second season starts with Spider-Man having a nightmare about Venom. Even if you don't believe it, this is something more common than you think. The intro of the show changes to feature Liz Allan and Norman Osborn, characters that have not been featured in the intro before. Through all Season 2, we'll see characters in the intro that weren't featured in the first season. Peter Parker mentions needing to buy a thermal suit to not freeze while doing Spider-Man stuff, because it's winter.
Now I'll have to buy a pair of those expensive skin-tight thermals.
In this episode, we can see that Spider-Man suffers from this problem. But in the next episode, this is no longer an issue, which means that he bought the thermal suit before the next episode started.
You know when you put your tongue on the side of the ship and it sticks there? I hate when I do that. Just saying.
Do I even have to say something? That's a cameo of the legend himself, Stan Lee. We miss you, King. Peter Parker's teacher mentions subjects that they are studying.
For example, survival of the fittest, natural selection.
But they are the names of the first 2 episodes. In this episode, Spider-Man fights Mysterio, whose secret identity is Quentin Beck, character that we saw in a previous episode. Mysterio's first appearance was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 13. There's a special cameo that is really easy to miss.
I'm thinking it's safer inside.
That character was voiced by Greg Weisman, main producer of the show. The spell that Mysterio uses is a reference to gargoyles, show that Greg Weisman created.
Fulminus Benitez!
But there's more. We can hear the same spell in the show Young Justice, show that Greg Weisman also produced.
Fulmina Benitez!
In this episode, Dr. Miles Warren is introduced, better known as the Jackal in the comics. There's an animation error while Spider-Man is fighting Mysterio. A part of his suit that should be blue was colored red instead.
Mr. Osborn's on his way.
That character is named Donald Menken and is voiced by Greg Weisman. Spider-Man blinding himself to know which illusions of Mysterio were real through his spider sense might have been what inspired this scene in Spider-Man Far From Home. One of the things that Spider-Man says to one of Mysterio's robots is a reference to gargoyles.
Oh, come on. What are you gonna do, bite my kneecaps off?
What are you going to do?
bite my kneecaps off.
And that wraps up things for this episode. The first thing that we see being Kraven fighting a rhinoceros is probably a reference to Rhino. This episode starts pretty similar to an episode from Gargoyles, where Kraven in this show and the pack in Gargoyles are enticed to hunt their prey by an anonymous benefactor. This time, the intro features Flash Thompson. In this episode, we're introduced to Deborah Whitman.
Pete, this is Deborah Whitman. She's the new Eddie.
Character from the comics, but you might know her because she appeared in Spider-Man the Animated Series, but she is not that relevant in this show. Spider-Man fights Kraven the Hunter in this episode. Kraven's first appearance was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 15.
There's no need for melodrama.
This is the first and only time that we can see a real gun in the whole show. Most criminals and police officers have guns that shoot either lasers, cannonballs, or anything but bullets. Dr. Miles Warren creates a serum that turns Kraven into a lion. This is pointing out that in the now-cancelled third season, we might have possibly seen Dr. Miles Warren become the Jackal. This isn't the first time that we see Kraven the Hunter turn into an animal. Kraven using either magic or science to enhance his body is something that he usually does. In the previous episode and in this one, we have been hearing about a secret character named Master Planner.
Everything proceeds according to my master plan. I'm called the Master Planner.
But if you know a bit about comics, you'll know that he's Dr. Octopus. And with that, we wrap up this episode. The third episode of the second season starts with Spider-Man interrogating Frederick Foswell, although Spider-Man doesn't recognize him because he's wearing a costume. Then we move on to the Tinkerer being revealed as the right hand of the Master Planner. The Tinkerer's first appearance was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 2, although there, he's the right hand of the Vulture. This lineup of the Sinister Six is closer to the one in the comics. Doc Ock is a patient in Ravencroft. There we can see Cletus Cassidy, aka Carnage.
That's encouraging news, Cletus.
It is confirmed that in the now-cancelled third season, we will have seen Carnage. While fighting the Sinister Six, Spider-Man's suit gets covered in ice. There's continuity errors in his suit. The snow disappears and then reappears again from one scene to the other. Before the episode ends, we can see Cletus Cassidy one last time, reminding us of what it could have been. And with that, we wrap up this episode. Episode 5 of the second season starts with Norman Osborn introducing Peter to Maurice Bench.
Peter, this is Morris Bench, our demolitions expert.
Nice setup. Wireless?
Completely. When we're clear, I remote activate the countdown, and cascading detonations bring the building down in its own footprint.
If you know a bit about comics, you'll know that Maurice Bench is Hydro Man. He was supposed to be a villain in the now cancelled third season. But there's more. Maurice Bench was voiced by Bill Fagerbakke, better known as the voice of Patrick from SpongeBob. Which is funny, because both Patrick and Hydro Man are characters that are related to water in some way. Hydro characters, if you will. Doc Ock left a note on the coffee maker, reminding the rest of the Sinister Six to clean after themselves, which implies that one of them made a mess before. Who are you betting on? Personally, I think that it was the Rhino. Also, he drinks from a mug with the text, Evil Genius. Peter Parker's order number on the coffee shop is 117.
117!
Oh, that's us.
And Doc Ock hacks a satellite named SSM-117. All of this happens on the 17th episode of the show. A bunch of debris falls on Spider-Man, which he struggles to lift. This is a reference to The Amazing Spider-Man issue 31, If This Be My Destiny, where the same happens, and Spider-Man has to find his inner strength to lift the rubble. But in that comic, Spider-Man is motivated because he has to save Aunt May, and here he has to save Gwen Stacy. This episode ends with Peter and Liz Allan kissing. Most of the times that the characters kissed, the voiced actors also shared a kiss. This was the case with Gwen and Peter as well. Alana Ubach is the voice actress of Liz Allan, and Lacey Chabert is the voice of Gwen Stacy. And with that, we wrap up this episode. Harry Osborn appears on the intro, which spoils this episode a little bit, because one of the biggest plot reveals of this episode is that Harry returns from his trip to Europe, which happens almost halfway through the episode. Sandman builds a sandcastle for a little girl. This might be a reference to a deleted scene in Spider-Man 3, where Sandman builds a sandcastle for his daughter. Flash Thompson's birthday is celebrated in this episode. Here, we can see his mom, Rosie Thompson. Her design was inspired after her voice actress, Vanessa Marshall. It is worth mentioning that she is also the voice of Mary Jane. There's a reference to gargoyles while Spider-Man is fighting Sandman. Sandman becomes giant, and Spider-Man says this.
Great, how am I supposed to beat up a beach?
You beat up a beach!
Eddie Brock follows Spider-Man in order to retrieve the symbiote, but there is something weird. Eddie Brock shoots webs for some reason, which doesn't make any sense, unless he built his own web shooters. And with that, we wrap up this episode. This episode starts with Glory Grant reciting some lines from a play from Shakespeare.
By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes.
Throughout the whole episode, we can see other students from Midtown recite more lines from Shakespeare plays. This is because Greg Weisman is a big fan of Shakespeare. Then we move on to Venom committing crime while pretending to be Spider-Man. As previously mentioned, this is something that Venom used to do.
I got you, Johnny!
John Jameson was strong enough to literally throw Spider-Man away. And still, Jonah was strong enough to stop his son. That's an example of that strength if I ever seen one. Because John Jameson got exposed to radiation while he was on the moon, he became Captain Jupiter. This is something that also happened in the comics, although there, his suit was created by Iron Man. Every time that Captain Jupiter jumps, we can hear this sound effect.
Colonel Jupiter, away!
Which is a sound effect that was used in the show The $6 Million Man. Jameson goes to George Stacy to demand the arrest of Spider-Man because of Venom's recent crimes while pretending to be Spidey. George Stacy shows some clips of symbiote Spider-Man. Those clips are from previous episodes. Venom reveals Spider-Man's identity to the Bugle, and with that we wrap up this episode. Episode 7 of the second season starts with Robbie showing a header of a news article. If you find this familiar, it's because it's pretty similar to when Spider-Man's identity was revealed in Spider-Man No Way Home. Flash Thompson falls in love with a girl named Shashan. If you're like me, you thought that she was originally created for the show. But it turns out that she also exists in the comics, although there she also has a small role. There's a scene where the eyes of Martha Connors have the wrong color during one frame. Her eyes are the same color as her lips. Probably an animation error due to rushing this episode. I don't know if this is an animation error, but it's kinda funny how in this scene where Venom and Spider-Man are falling inside Midtown High School, there's like 50 floors, while the building on the outside has 4 floors. Even if it had a basement, it still looks kinda silly. Flash Thompson has a picture in his locker that is kinda questionable. I wonder what other things he has inside of it.
But I've come to realize that if Spider-Man's true identity was revealed, everyone he cared about would be in constant danger. Maybe a man in a mask doesn't have something to hide, but something to protect. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, sir.
He totally knows that Peter Parker is a Spider-Man. And with that, we wrap up this episode. This episode features Captain George Stacy in the intro, one of the few times that he gets credited. In this episode, Silver Sable is introduced. Her first appearance was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 265. There's a scene in this episode where Peter looks at a newspaper snippet, but if you read the article, it has nothing to do with the header. The text on this article is almost identical to the text that appears on the newspaper of the intro. Maybe this was done to save time, because most likely this was not meant to be read. That also happens a second time, but the text barely changes. Peter delivers some photos to Jameson, but those pictures are frames from this episode. Since we are getting near to the end of the show, it's getting harder to find Easter eggs. Nevertheless, there's some interesting stuff that we haven't seen yet. That said, we wrap up things for this episode. Episode 9 of the second season starts with the Enforcers being the main villains of this episode, but this time they have upgraded suits, thanks to the Tinkerer.
Some believe the wearer actually takes on the personality of the mask.
Obviously, this is hinting to the fact that Norman Osborn is the Green Goblin, but later on the episode we see this, hinting that Harry Osborn is the Green Goblin. Obviously, the main objective is to confuse you.
You're late!
I,
Crashed your bike?
Yeah, my bike.
More proof that George Stacy knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. This episode features Hobie Brown, who you might know because he's the original Prowler in the comics, although it's unknown if they had intentions of turning him into the Prowler in this show. While Spider-Man is fighting Shocker, Shocker says this.
Never did like to see a poor, dumb animal suffer.
This dialogue will be later referenced in the show Young Justice, that was also produced by Greg Weisman.
No, I hate to see any poor animals suffer.
And with that, we wrap up this episode. There's a long brawl in this episode between all the gang lords. It takes place during a performance of Verdi's opera, Rigolero. The use of music and the whole episode itself was inspired by the Godfather movies. Do you remember about these characters? Well, in this episode the dude proposes the girl. They getting married. There's an error on Spider-Man's back symbol while he's fighting Tombstone. His spider logo is black instead of red. There's a hidden detail on the opera. All the characters die except the Jester, who is dressed all in green. This is obviously foreshadowing that the Green Goblin will take over the criminal world. And with that, we wrap up this episode. In episode 11 of the second season, Spider-Man fights Molten Man. His first appearance was in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 28. In the comics, he is only a stepbrother of Liz Allan, but here they are proper brother and sister. Episode 12 of the second season starts with Black Cat trying to infiltrate inside Riker's maximum security prison. She uses a fake ID with the name Selina Drew. This is a reference to both Catwoman from Batman, whose real name is Selina Kyle, and Spider-Woman, whose real name is Jessica Drew. In this episode it is revealed that Black Cat's father, Walter Hardy, is the killer of Uncle Ben, change that I personally dislike, but I can easily ignore. This episode features a play started by the students of Midtown High School, where the writers try to use the students to represent the relationship between the Green Goblin and Spider-Man. And with that, we wrap up these episodes. The last episode of the second season features Gwen Stacy's redesign on the intro, change that was just made for this episode, but probably would have stayed if they made another season. This episode contains a lot of recycled art from promotionals. This happens because they were in a tight schedule to release this episode. Gwen Stacy's headband changed from red to black in this episode. According to some designers, her headband would have stayed black in the now cancelled third season. And with that, we wrap up this show. The Spectacular Spider-Man is a show that has a special place in my heart. I wouldn't have made an almost 1 hour video if I didn't love this show. The Spectacular Spider-Man made me feel like Spider-Man was there for me, extending his hand every time that I fell, and reassuring me that the pain, the struggle was worth it. This is my favorite Spider-Man cartoon and one of my favorite Spider-Man adaptations of all time. Thank you so much for watching all the way, and I'll see you the next time.